Hey, let's talk about games. Hello there and welcome back. I'm Inoculator and today we're going to be doing a tanking guide for Inquisitor Martyr, and this is going to be a complete A to Z for new players and experienced players. I'm going to put some timestamps down below in the comments so you can look up the sections you want to if you feel you already know some of the basics. So again, what we're going to do to get started first is just define the differences between the two main classes, because obviously this is something to take into account when you first pick up the game. A crusader, generally speaking, not only has more mitigation than the assassin, but also has dramatically more health. So this is really something to take into account when building a tank. Obviously the assassin can be a tank, just not a very good one. So for the purposes of demonstration, we're going to be loading in with our lovely crusader here, and here we are in the game. Now, one of the most important things that I think is often overlooked as tanks is the Inoculator. Now, I say this because most Inoculators are very, very poorly fine-tuned. It's worth considering two things. First up, what do you need from the Inoculator? And secondly, how much of it do you need from the Inoculator? Often people will chase the most expensive, best heal possible, but as you can see, when I do this, I now have two usages. When I select this heal, when I select the cheaper one, I have 17. So this is something you really have to weigh up the pros and cons of what you need from a mission as well as how much you need. Now, you can as well leave slots empty once you've unlocked that ability. It's quite useful actually, because then you have even more uses. You don't have to worry too much on the cooldown because we're going to be working around this later on, so I wouldn't really recommend speccing into stuff to make the actual cooldown lower. We'll come back to that later. So for now, I would suggest if you have an Inoculator and you're able to go for one that has a double heal or a heal and a plus suppression, because those two things are going to be the real stuff that you need within a battle. So now we can move on from the Inoculators. Let's talk about gear. If we go over to the station over here, we can talk about the various armor types because there are a difference between them. You'll notice from the armor we have equipped, which has a rating of 20, we'll bring that up in just a second. If we compare that to the other two types, they both have a lower mitigation percentage. So you'll see here on the right we have 20 damage reduction with our assault armor. We only have 12 with the ranged demolition armor. So if you're wanting to be as tanky as possible, yes, you could be a ranged tank and you would absorb less damage with the demolition armor, but the assault armor is going to make you as tanky as possible. Obviously it's more geared towards being a melee. However, having the ability to reposition should not be sniffed at even for a ranged character. And I would argue the assault armor here is really the obvious choice because it also allows you to reposition very, very easily, and that's useful for everyone. If you're stuck in the middle of a pack and you need to get from A to B, the best way to do that is to fly. If you're going to walk from A to B, you're always going to be taking more damage while doing so, so having that extra leap ability really is super important in terms of mitigation. Plus, its very, very low cooldown is also going to be very helpful when we come to our skills because it's going to be providing us with an extra heal. And while we're talking about equipment, it's really important to take into consideration your equipment choice in terms of your belt. Obviously, offensive things will be viable, killing enemies so you take less damage is of course absolutely fine, but for the purpose of this video we're going to be focusing on the defensive ones. I've arranged them neatly down here in the bottom right. The personal void shield is perhaps the best. It gives you 4,000 hit points effectively, which last until they've been removed, which is a very, very good way of just giving yourself an instant boost or steroid of a health pool as such. Very, very useful. They used to stack, I believe they don't anymore, but they are still pretty goddamn good. The force field as well is quite useful. It gives you damage immunity for 5 seconds and, well, has a very short cooldown, so it is quite useful for some of the more intense fights. However, I think this is perhaps slightly more geared towards the squishy characters, but if you're playing very hard difficulty, then you might well find this a lifesaver. 5 seconds to rush a turret or to take out a dreadnought when you're just about to die is really the difference between life or death in some situations. Now, from there, we also have the scatter field. This has some use. It's a AoE knockback around your character. Of course, if you get over encumbered, surrounded by enemies, it's useful to push them back. I wouldn't say it's one that we should really be prioritising though if we have any mobility, because mobility really does make this item somewhat redundant unless you have no AoE attacks and you really desperately need a means to take out Nurglings, but it's kind of a waste. Moving on from here, we have the Refractor Field, which is of some use as well. I think for the Crusader this is quite good because the extra damage reduction really just means you're taking even less, and it gives you suppression resist per second for 30 seconds. With a 40-second cooldown, this is active for, well, 3/4 of the time. It's pretty good. I'd consider using this. Try it yourself, but of course you're going to have to make sure you've got healing coming in from elsewhere, because, well, the Void Shield perhaps is going to be the better option if you're finding your health is getting low and you'd rather use this as a panic button. But if you want to use it before you go into a fight, the Force Field is quite good. Now, there are a couple of others too, but these are the ones that I personally feel would be better suited to you and your tankiness. I hope you find them useful. Now let's move on. Now, I will do a brief talk on weapons as well. Either shield is a viable option. Of course, one has more defensive abilities and an AoE knockback, aka the Suppression Shield, compared to the other, which has a charge. Now, again, they both have their place in the world. The charge is of course useful. It allows you to cover ground when your assault pack's on cooldown. It is very, very handy to have a charge to be able to move in and out of combat. Of course, the deflect on both is very useful, but I would state that if you have a two-handed weapon, that does still have some deflect. And if you're concerned or curious what deflect is, it's basically a dodge chance. So this weapon will give me an 8% chance to completely mitigate an attack that bounces off of my armor. So it's useful to have. Generally speaking, the two-handers are going to have more AoE abilities. The single-handers and shields are going to have more single target, but some AoE abilities. The total amount of deflect you'll get from the two weapons, of course, does exceed. Yes, this weapon's a little bit crappy on too, but it will generally exceed the two-handed options. So this is something to take into account, but of course every weapon stats are randomized, so keep an eye on what you can find and what looks good. I'm going to go for the purpose of this tank with a single target ability, which we'll come back to later as to why, and we're going to go with the Suppression Shield because I like having the AoE knockback, and I'm going to go with the Assault Pack to make sure I've still got all of that lovely, lovely mobility. Now, if you're a new character, you're probably ready to jump in here. You don't have much else to worry about in terms of skills and selecting and optimizing armor. But for those of you that have some skill points, we're going to go into spending them now and how to make a pretty viable tanky build that's very, very survivable. And it's a little bit more complicated than one might give credit for. So for the purposes of demonstration, I've had to bring up my assassin here because my crusader doesn't have enough skill points, and with the reset coming in a few weeks, I'm not going to level up a crusader just for the sake of doing a tutorial. But I will. I love the crusader, and I'm thinking of going back to them next time. Now, you'll start off here by saying, Hydra, this is not a tanking build. Look at this single target DPS. This is ridiculous. Well, on our crusader, which is going to have a very meaty amount of hit points, having the single target 10% of your life on enemy kill is incredibly valuable. You're talking a few hundred hit points here. Very, very useful every time you kill an enemy with a single target ability. And if you're using a single-handed weapon, or even some of the two-handed weapons will have single target abilities, it's very, very powerful, very, very good for survivability, and I think it's worth considering, although not mandatory. If we move on from there down to the support tree, again, you mentioned this, again, I mentioned earlier the assault pack. Let's close the chat down there. Get out of it. If I return us to the previous conversation we were having regarding the Assault Pack, you'll notice that it has a very, very low cooldown, which combines very, very well with Invigorating Faith, giving you what is effectively another Inoculator, 0.5% of your hit points per focus point spent. It's very, very handy, and of course we do get a little bit of reduction for our focus skills on the way. It's also entirely possible to spec into Inoculator capacity. It's quite useful, not essential, but it is something I would definitely consider. Moving on from here, the Suppression Tree has some quite nice abilities. We have 1, 2, 3% extra damage reduction while our suppression status is green. If you make good use of cover in between combat, you should be green for quite a long time. And of course we'll be using our assault pack to sort of jig during fights to make sure our suppression doesn't get too low to the point that we're getting slowed. As well as this, we're also going to get 10 hit points per second. It doesn't sound like a lot, but when you combine this with 3 or 4 other skills that'll also be giving us hit points per second, it does add up to quite a lot. Now moving on is obviously the more tanky of the abilities here. We have a lot of hit points coming on, which is 300, 600 in total here. which is adding to our total 4,000, giving us a pretty good hit point pool. And we have again some more hit points per second, which is always useful, but obviously this is only when our health drops low. The most important ability within the tanking tree at the moment, within the tanking build, is whenever your health gets low, your Inoculator cooldown resets. Now this is perhaps something that will be balanced because it doesn't seem to have an internal cooldown right now, but this is literally broken. You can go in with a very low cooldown, have 20 uses of an Inoculator, have a very high cooldown Inoculator, and whenever you get low, it's going to be ready for you. It's going to be there, which is incredibly broken. So this, for me, the most important ability if you want to be a tank, if you want to be survivable, heck, even if you've just got 4 points spare for anyone else, it's broken. Now, for the rest, we're just going with the standard tanky things. We're going to go for a little bit of warp resist, but we're really just getting that to get to its more attractive sister, skeletal padding, which is a nice 20% damage reduction from our armor. Now, you might be wondering over here, 20% damage reduction in cover, is that really necessary? Maybe not, but the 3% damage reduction when standing still is quite nice, and the extra 6% physical resist, which is pretty much all enemy range projectiles that aren't heat based. It's quite useful because range projectiles really are a little bit of a headache. As well as that, it's most of enemy melee attacks, so well, that's just most of the stuff in the game. Now obviously I only have about 25 skill points here. If you wanted to spend some more, I would say quite easily going into the physical resist tree is going to be of some use because of the amount of physical abilities in the game. There are more and more warp abilities being added, so that's something certainly to consider. Heat resist has its place, but I tend to try and kill those enemies first. You could certainly go into it if you wished. There are also some other abilities within the movement tree which you could consider. Things that will, well, make you move quicker, some things that will lower your cooldowns, and a couple in particular that will have an impact on your mobility cooldowns. So if you have, let's say, the two-handed hammer on the Crusader, you could make use of that and have an ability or a skill or a build where you can charge as many times as possible. And hats off to that hammer, by the way. It's also pretty good for a tank build because, again, it gives you more mobility and allows you to reposition more often. And that Inoculator will always be there when you need it, so not having the extra mitigation from a shield's not the end of the world. Now, moving forward from here, it's good to have a little bit of a conversation about what to look out for on your items, because there's lots of stats and some of them aren't particularly well explained. So just to give you a little bit of a rundown, a very brief one, dodge, again, is a chance to completely mitigate an attack. So 25% on the assassin, 25% of attacks that go for me will miss. That's all it does. It doesn't deflect them back or do anything else. It's called dodge on the assassin, deflect on a crusader, but that's how it works. Damage reduction percentage is as it sounds. I'm up to 17% on the assassin here, thanks to some specs and stats that I spec'd into. But with a crusader, this can quite easily go up to 40% plus. Physical resist, heat resist, warp resist doesn't have a percentage attached, and truth be told, no one actually knows if this is just a damage minus or if this is something different. We can only guess, but with the damage of weapons being around 100 at this point in time, it's not going to be that different depending on which, so we have no idea. Those are going to be the main things to look out for, but health is incredibly valuable, and a little bit of health regeneration per second is of course going to be useful. Because many of the things within the tanking builds, though, are going to be giving you a percentage of your life, basically the Inoculator as well as the single target skill, having more life does equate to having more healing. So going for bonuses to your total health pool is incredibly useful. You can also, though, keep an eye out for weapons and have a look at health regained per hit. Very, very handy, and if you attack multiple enemies with one single AoE strike, it does give you health per enemy hit, which is quite effective. It's not really as much as some other games may give you in terms of a life regenerate, life leech build, but it does give you a little bit of life trickling in it, something to keep an eye out for. And of course then we move on to perks, and the perks I think I'm going to save for another video looking at total and then we look at perks, and I think for perks, or the purposes of perks, I'm going to be, and then we look into perks. Now I'm going to be actually saving perks for another video talking about the various combinations, but just take into consideration that once you reach a sufficient rank, good luck hitting 60 or 90, once you reach a and then we move on to perks. Now I'm going to be saving these for another video, and good luck getting to level 60 and level 90 by the way. But there are plenty of perks which add to the ability of your character to tank effectively. Some of them for the assassin will really contribute to more dodge, some of them for the crusader will just be damage mitigation. They're pretty handy, but again, we're going to be saving them for another video. Now guys, that is probably all you need to know in terms of building your character, what skills to go for, what equipment to go for, how to gear your inoculator and what to focus on. Keep in mind that inoculator reset can be incredibly valuable. I know I've saying this for the third time, but it really is game breaking. And guys, let me know what other guides you'd like to see down below. And remember, I have an entire playlist here of guides, so check them out down in the little box down here. Guys, have yourself a great week. I'll see you next time.